We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
Welcome to Multipolarity. This week we have a guest who needs little to no introduction. It's Malcom Kyeyune, journalist, provocateur, and friend of the show. So welcome back, Malcolm. It's been a few weeks.
Yeah, and nothing has happened in the meantime, right?
No. It's been all very calm, and everything is fine, and everything's normal. Keep calm and carry on. We'll start, I think, with the big event that should be related to Malcom Kyeyune thought, which is a military doctrine. Obviously, we know by now. So maybe we'll start with the Chinese military parade. You have some thoughts on that. I think you were venting on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people who are listening to this have watched the Chinese military parade and probably also the American one. And if you haven't watched both, you should. It's an interesting comparison. I'll leave it at that. The Chinese were celebrating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II for them. As people sometimes forget, China was one of the major belligerents in World War II, losing like 20 million people, so almost as many as the Soviets, who lost, I think, like 26. This parade was meant to send a message to the West, and to the Americans specifically, which is why it featured, which it hadn't before, I don't think. Like, it featured nuclear ballistic missiles, for example, inside the parade, which I could be wrong about this, but I don't think they've been on the sort of parade schedule before, even though the Chinese have had them. But apart from nuclear missiles, you just had like a lot of like really well-drilled soldiers, and you had a lot of like new technology, including a lot of unmanned drones of various configurations, unmanned like helicopters, like new sort of laser weaponry and so on. And again, I bring up the American military parade because the military parade in the US was meant to commemorate the 250th birthday of the army. And it was kind of shambolic, if we're being honest. You saw a lot of Western hoping, as the kids like to say, about the results of this military parade. So people were saying stuff like, an army that drills well or like looks good in a parade, like that's the same as an army that can't fight. And the Americans, because they can't do a parade, that means they can fight. And if you asked Americans 50 years ago, they would say that's nonsense. And like, we can throw up a parade like everyone else. Like, these two things they're not just unrelated, like they're related in a positive way, in the sense that you still do marching in boot camp in America, because marching, since the time we started doing it, is useful for building cohesion and esprit de corps inside a unit. And having like soldiers be able to coordinate with each other for complex tasks is obviously a benefit in warfare. And if they can't even march in step, that raises some question in that area. But it also shows that, like, for whatever reason, like the military is not actually practicing, like even for an event that of pretty big magnitude. And then you had other copes about the Chinese sort of, the state of the Chinese military in terms of equipment. And people were saying stuff like, okay, well, yeah, they have some new equipment, and yes, the West doesn't have unmanned helicopters or jet-powered like companion drones for fighter jets, for example, even though I think those are at least on the drawing table in the West. But in China, they already have them. And, Chinese tanks are far newer than American ones. And their latest tank, I think, was basically finished or taken into service officially this year or the year before this one. And it features, among other things, like some sort of radar system built into the tank, as well as a hybrid motor, so like a diesel electrical motor. Might be useful on a battlefield, might not, but what all of these things that the Chinese showed off really illustrate is that China has the ability not just to manufacture a lot of stuff, but they can actually come up with a weapons program, like a concept, and go from concept to prototype to like limited trial production to full production and like the taking into service a new weapon or platform in the span of, let's say, like 3 or 4 years for a lot of stuff. Inside the US today, insofar as there are new weapon programs actually like still in development, which increasingly is not the case even. But insofar as weapons programs exist in the US, like we're talking timelines of 10 to 15 to 20 years for a lot of stuff. And moreover, the Americans have now lost the ability to actually maintain the military they have. And I'm not even talking like maintenance as, you know, a plane, some component breaks, and then you send it to a depot. Like they have huge trouble with that as well. But I'm talking about like you have a carrier-based Navy with 11 like nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. You can't use normal jet planes on an aircraft carrier because they have to be navalized. They have to be made compatible with the arrestor hook and catapult system that carriers use. And this involves like a lot of design trade-offs. So it's not a small change. You have to specifically develop planes to be able to use carriers. Well, why is this relevant? Well, in the case of the US, right now they're using the F-18, like the Super Hornet, as their principal carrier-capable aircraft. The Hornet and the Super Hornet, these are really old, and like the airframes are very old. And the F-45 has such huge problems that the Navy essentially doesn't want to buy any because they're almost useless. And the problem is that the Navy just announced that they're basically putting on ice or like withdrawing the funding from the plane meant to replace the Super Hornet or the F-45. So you have all of these carriers, you have planes that have maybe 10 years left of their active service life before, you know, metal fatigue means you can't really use these planes anymore. And there's nothing in the pipeline. Like the project they had to replace these planes so they could actually use their carriers as anything else than oversized paperweights, it's been cancelled. And this is down the line, like the Army just cancelled their M10 Booker tank. The Air Force cancelled their Next Generation Air Dominance program, or nearly cancelled, like took away all the funding. So it might still exist on the books, but like they're not going to go ahead with it. And so the US has basically stopped not just producing things. This is something people talk about a lot, like the problems with making new artillery shells. Well, I mean, there is literally no future for the American military if you by future mean that there will be like new weapons 20 years from now. And like there are huge glaring holes where nobody really even has an answer to, okay, what do we do when we can't use Hornets anymore? Everyone reasons that like the moment this question becomes relevant, like they've gotten out, they have their pension, and so the collapse of the Navy, it's not their problem.
Yeah, the thing that struck me was that a lot of Americans, and I don't just mean like average Americans, I mean like Americans that are on Twitter and following closely military affairs specifically, and I think they think they're following geopolitical affairs by like consuming like, you know, slop accounts effectively. But I mean, I guess at least like the accounts will cover things that happen in the world, and in that sense, some of these accounts that people might know whom I'm talking about get some sort of a sense of what's going on in the world. I think a lot of these people were absolutely shocked by the military parade. My sense of them was they really did live in a world where the United States had its problems militarily. They probably knew some of those problems. They probably knew problems with the F-35 program, as you mentioned, or they knew that there was a recruitment crisis, or they knew that there was a suicide crisis. But all these things were viewed as isolated problems, I think, by this kind of group. And I think this group is effectively the military. I think we're describing most of the military. And they saw these things as isolated problems, and they still basically assumed that America was on top in terms of technology. And I got the sense from interacting with one or two of them and following a lot of the accounts after the Chinese military parade that they were shaken out of that. I mean, it was pretty hard to deny. You might say that the Chinese have only kind of caught up with the Americans. I don't personally think that. They displayed some technology there that is clearly a few years ahead, at least, maybe 5 or something like that, of the Americans. And also, as you say, their fighter jets, their tanks, they're just newer. These aren't 40-year-old models like the Americans are still using. So I think that did sink in with these people. And I think that they basically reverted, as far as I could tell, from a position that was basically like, yeah, China, it's fake, like the hypersonic missile program's fake. They're actually just like, backwards, and they have similar equipment to Russia, which they view as very low tech and so on, even though it's winning a war in Ukraine, but whatever. That's how they kind of viewed it. And I think now they've been kind of brought at least to the point where they're like, okay, China has the same technology as us. They say the same. They won't say better. It's kind of got the same as us. And they're falling back on kind of like, but they can't project power because they don't have aircraft carriers. And of course, they're not going to have to think through that for a long time. Does projection of power actually work anymore? Does it mean anything? Are aircraft carriers redundant technology? Some of the stuff we've talked about with you on the show before, Malcolm. But the point is that they've definitely got up to the point now where they can't deny that the Chinese are at very least at technological par with the United States. And as you say, they're even coping on this kind of like military organizational component. Like the notion that being able to stage a big mass parade with soldiers doesn't equate in some way to a well-organized army is just, it's beyond me. I mean, it actually, anyone who makes that argument, I wouldn't trust to run, a division in an army or like even a brigade or anything. I mean, like that's crazy thinking. But, I mean, what if people have been doing all these years doing military drilling? I guess it was all just a waste of time because we figured out you can just, like, be an entrepreneur on the battlefield or something like that. But I definitely got the sense, anyway, that they've been pulled at least up to a certain level of reality. And I still don't really know what that means, but it's got to mean something. Have you given it any thought?
There's, like, this term which has a specific meaning in terms of psychology, like normalization, where you basically get used to something to the point where you can't really see it as just how odd it is in reality. Like you basically adjust to something that's crazy. And I think like Americans were basically normalizing decline and decadence in the terms of, okay, well, yeah, we have the F-35, for example, and it's like a 25-year-old long-run boondoggle. And it turns out that after 4 years, like the planes, their readiness rating crashes. So this is still, after all of these fixes, all of the attempts to salvage the F-35 program, like it's a useless weapon for war because it never works. Well, people look at that and they say, yeah, okay, we in America, we have some problems, but this is just like, it doesn't get any better than this text. Like, it's this or nothing, right? If you want super high-tech advanced weapons of the future. The Chinese not only like wreck that, because at this point, they have their equivalents to American technology, and they have a lot of technology that the Americans don't have. But also, if you think about a war, if you think about World War II as an example, most weapons are crap. Like you design a weapon in peacetime and it turns out that the soldiers hate it or it's built wrong somehow. Like it's not up to spec. Anyone who cares about this stuff can find a million examples. But like if we think about British tanks or American tanks for that matter, like British tanks, half of them were crap. Like they were garbage. But like the people who built those tanks didn't set out to build garbage. Like they had ideas about how the battlefield of the future would look, and they balanced those against, economic resource constraints and so on, and they tried to do the best they could. And then they often learned from those tanks that were crap, and then they went to the factories and started building tanks that were less crap. Well, America can't do that at all. This is normal in warfare, and people who were saying, like, I don't think those Chinese robot drones, like the dogs or whatever, are gonna work in trenches. I mean, I belong to those people who think that, 60% maybe of the Chinese kit they showed off, it's never gonna be like widely adopted because it's not gonna prove to be cost effective. But that's not a criticism. Like, you have to do that. You have to develop a lot of stuff, and you have to build it, and you have to test it, and then you can figure out like what works and what doesn't. That is normal, but Americans can no longer do that. And for a long time, they normalized not being able to do that. So, Ukraine, for example, when you've used the Abrams tank, right? It turns out that the Abrams tank, it's not particularly a favorite among the Ukrainians. Why? Because it's really heavy, which was a design consideration that mattered less when the Abrams was designed, because people imagined using it defensively in Europe, not in like a Ukrainian field or whatever. So the original designers would have said, yeah, well, we don't care. Like, it's not meant for Ukraine. And it's also really bad at dealing with drones. And the original designers of the Abrams, if you said, why did you design a tank that can't handle drones, that have all of these weaknesses, that if you fly a remote-controlled mine or whatever into this specific spot on the turret, the Abrams turns out to be really vulnerable. Well, the designers would say, why should we design our tank in the fucking 1970s for a weapon that's not going to be relevant until 2020? Design your own goddamn tank. And so in any war, you're going to have like all of these learning experiences where the thing you thought would work wouldn't. Well, what the parade really showed was that the Chinese, if something doesn't work, it's not a big problem for them because they can just build something else. And the West cannot. And at this point, we have like this narcissistic injury, like psychological collapse. Because we can't pretend that not being able to build stuff is like in any way indicative of being like a serious power anymore.
Yeah, one thing I have noticed is the way that the Chinese are developing 6th generation fighter jets and the myriad of drones that they're creating. And I don't just mean drones that you kind of hold in your hand and they zip up and they can maybe carry a landmine or an artillery shell. I mean, like proper, big drones the size of fighter jets or the size of ordinary airplanes. And it reminded me of something I read years ago, and it was related to a chart that basically had on the x-axis, it had the the cost of per fighter jet, and then on the y-axis over time, and you have this like direct line going up, like this perfectly proportional line going up. And the author said, like, look, if we continue on this trend where over time fighter jets just become more and more expensive, and the F-35 was right at the top right-hand corner of this chart. He said, like, the entire US defense budget eventually is going to be spent on a single, exquisitely designed, amazingly capable fighter jet. And the article discussed a whole range of ways that they could get around that. And one of the things that they mentioned was, and this was years ago now, the way that Tesla updated their software, for example, like and the way Google updated its software for Chrome, the browser that perhaps all our listeners are using at this very moment. Before Chrome came along, you would get these like big updates like Microsoft Internet Explorer or like Netscape or Firefox. They would release an update like twice a year or 3 times a year. But Chrome just kept releasing updates every few days, few weeks, right? And that turned out to be a much more efficient way of developing and improving a browser. And Tesla did something similar with its software as well. And the author discussed a whole range of systems of manufacturing and development that worked on similar principles, not just with software, but with various items of manufactured physical goods as well. And one of the things that I've noticed with the way that the Chinese are working is that it really seems as though their manufacturing expertise is rolling over into their military development and the way that they develop things. Because right now we have not one but 3 sixth generation fighter jets that we've seen, that have been filmed, that have been photographed. Who knows what else is happening in the background? And it seems that the process of design, prototype, experimentation, production, improvement, that this kind of whole cycle is whirring. This whole wheel is whirring in China so much faster, and this could actually have, I think people perhaps haven't woken up to the fact that this could have pretty devastating consequences for the balance of power certainly in the Western Pacific and eventually in the world itself. Because, we've spoken on multipolarity before, and I've written an essay, Malcolm, about how the Chinese are starting to lead in basic scientific research. They're starting to lead in almost every category of high-tech applied scientific research. So that is scientific research, but not the kind of the basic theoretical stuff, the stuff that applies directly to specific areas and specific industries in the high-tech sphere. And also they've developed a high-tech, kind of high-value-add manufacturing ecosystem in areas like drones, cars, phones, robotics, all of these kind of things. Thinking about it, before you came on, I suddenly realized, well, yeah, this makes perfect sense that they've done all of this, and they've got all of this manufacturing expertise, and they have developed this ecosystem that's directly relevant to the military, and they are the world leaders in manufacturing, not just cheap goods anymore, but higher end stuff. Well, of course, the gears of developing military platforms are whirring faster. And I think that maybe, getting back to the military parade, that was a kind of wake-up call for people. Like it's always been, I'm not an expert in military affairs, let alone Chinese military affairs. But it's been apparent to me that this kind of stuff has been happening for a year or so at least. But it seems that people who are paid to comment on this in the mainstream media have kind of missed it, and the parade was a wake-up call. It's like, holy cow, they've got these drones that look like full-size super stealth fighter jets, and they're obviously going to be like loyal wingmen controlled by these like huge 6th-gen fighter jets that the Chinese are developing, and they've got these like armored laser platforms, and they've got this, and it's like, well, yeah, haven't you guys been paying attention? This the gears are just whirring at a faster rate in China.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it's not so much that the problem is that, well, the Chinese caught up to us while we weren't looking, or the Chinese, wow, they have more tanks than we thought they did. It's more that in the West, it has been normalized for a long time. You could basically pretend that not having the capacity to manufacture new stuff was this is what everyone is doing. This is the only alternative. And then it turns out that there are countries, especially China, and they have all the stuff that America had, all the capability that America, or for that matter, Europe had in World War II. And we were all saying that it's not World War II anymore, nothing like this exists in the world because everything has changed. Well, that was just a lie. And if you're going to go to war against China and they can manufacture new stuff and you can't, and it's not just about artillery grenades or whatever, who can make the most grenades. We know how 155 millimeter grenades are supposed to work, like artillery shells. But what if we need something new that we don't have, like a new kind of artillery or whatever. Well, there's no way to make that because there's no way to make new stuff in the US or the West. We can barely even make stuff that we have been making for 50, 60 years. Like, again, 155 millimeter artillery shells. We can barely make that. But like making new stuff, learning from things that go wrong, replacing losses and so on, this is normal in warfare. And if you can't do it, you can't actually go to war. And the hyper-reality, the nice little narrative about how everything had changed, like it fell apart partly as a result of that military parade. And it's hard to go back. Like once Humpty Dumpty is broken, it's not going to get put back together. And that is probably also why the US, to sort of transition to the other topic here, why there are now rumors in the Pentagon of the United States adopting a new defense policy document saying that from now on, deterring China in Asia is no longer a priority. And instead, we will focus on domestic and hemisphere issues.
Yeah, so just really quickly, before we move away from the military equipment issue, I don't think it's even going to be, if there's a big war, this stuff's going to be shown to all be fake. We'll talk about the potential pivot away from Asia in a moment. I think the real thing is just going to be, people are just going to start buying the Chinese stuff, and that'll stitch them into Chinese security architecture. I mean, everyone's talking about the Indian turn away from the West and toward China, and of course some of that was due to sanctions and so on. But I'm sure the Indian military got a sneak peek at some of that gear before the parade, and of course they saw it in action in the brief conflict with Pakistan, which frankly they lost. So I think actually the real thing that we're going to see now between now and maybe 2030, which is kind of seems to be the multipolarity singularity point at this stage, is just going to be that a bunch of countries are just going to figure we're better off buying this gear from the Chinese, just like we're better off buying laptops from them, and that's going to completely change the game in terms of security. But to move on from the military parade, obviously the geopolitical or geostrategic developments that have taken place since we last spoke have been pretty enormous. Of course, there is this turn toward the Western Hemisphere, which I think began effectively when the Trump administration started making noise about Greenland and Canada, which I haven't heard about in recently, but I did actually see that the so-called Greenland independence movement is gaining traction, and I think that might actually end up having some impact in Greenland down the line. We'll see what happens in Canada. We've made some not predictions, but we've made some indications that Alberta might be an interesting place to watch. But now it seems that attention is turning to South America. I'll give you my take on it. I thought that America wielded sufficient power in North America to actually probably have some success, and you don't need military or anything like that, just basic economic influence and political influence. I think the prospect of success there with a place like Greenland or even Canada, maybe not Canada itself, but some of the regions in Canada, the more oil-rich regions that feel themselves very alienated from the Canadian elite, I thought that was a viable project, and it might still end up being a viable project. Turning your attention to South America is a completely different thing. I think that the Americans had a sense that was going to be, I mean, we're still very early in the game there, but I do fear that they thought that was going to be easy pickings, that they kind of thought to themselves, well, back in the days of the banana republic of Del Monte down in, I can't remember where it was off the top of my head, Guatemala, wasn't it? Back in the day, we were so easily able to exercise influence over this region, and we just took our eyes off it when we started focusing on this kind of global power projection abroad. There's some truth to that. I don't want to say that it's completely incorrect. You definitely saw a peeling away of interest in Latin America, especially in the 1990s, kind of in the unipolar moment. You still see the interest there, the invasion of Grenada, the drug wars in the 80s, the Contra wars in the 80s. And then in the 1990s, it kind of pivots away from that whole region. So that definitely did happen. But, you know, in that 30 or 40 year period, an awful lot of stuff happened in South America. And so I always thought if you're going to try and create a Neo-Monroe doctrine, you're going to want to create it in a very, very subtle way. You're going to want to, you know, have to look at the power balance in the region. You're going to have to look at what countries like each other, what countries don't like each other, what America could provide for some of those countries, maybe investment, alternative investment opportunities to China. And maybe that wouldn't even be, you know, alternatives to the Belt and Road, which America probably couldn't provide. But, you know, even just dollar financing to a country like Argentina or something like that. Like, that seems to be like where you'd start on building the strategy. But as of right now, that is not where they've started building the strategy. Malcolm, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with the pivot away from Asia, and this is being like the rumors, and they are rumors at this point, but they're rumors with a lot of heft, let's just say. Like this is an ongoing debate inside the Pentagon. The policy document might not be adopted, but it's a live discussion, and it's probably a matter of time before, like, if not this year, then in 1 year or in 2 years. But the discussion right now about this is like, okay, well, we're probably not strong enough to take on China, but we can always, you know, as you said, like deal with these banana republics or whatever. But if we are to give the devil his due, if we're going to think about what the point of the China policy or the China first policy that is now being abandoned and that was always honored in the breach rather than in the observance, as they say. Someone like Elbridge Colby, like his argument in favor of the China first policy is that like this is necessary to protect American power and not in some like insipid, oh, well, we can't get semiconductors from anywhere else and we can't import them from China or whatever. It's more about if you actually surrender or run away in Asia, that is going to create a domino effect. Like the entire alliance structure that the US relies on today, it's going to fall apart. And less often said, but I think like entertained or meditated upon in private, is the fact that not only will your allies turn away, like if you can't protect Taiwan, Japan is not really going to be interested in being your military vassal against China. Like that is over, fine. But also, and this relates to South America, if you cut tail and run in China or in Taiwan, the Chinese will be free to roam and they will come roaming to South America. Like they no longer have to worry about using all of that shiny military equipment they're making to protect their national interests, 50 miles from the shore. Okay, well, 8,000 miles away or whatever, there might be new users for that kind of stuff. And particularly new users that might have like a lot of national resources like oil, who would be very grateful. And moreover, the moment you see America sort of weakening and admitting to being weak, the calculus of a government like the Venezuelan government, like should we fight or should we just surrender, like that shifts immensely. Because if everyone is just beating up on the US and everyone who says we're not going to surrender to your demands, if all of them are doing fine, why would you want to surrender? So again, like to sort of state Elbridge Colby's argument and perhaps draw it a bit farther than he himself would be comfortable doing on the record. Once you abandon China, you will have like even the banana republics are going to start messing or, not following orders. And as, we've talked about a lot before, Philip, like military technology has also changed. Like Venezuela might not be able to afford a huge air force or whatever, but can they afford drones? Yeah, they can. It's actually like 150% the landmass of Ukraine, and it has a lot of jungle and so on. Trying to occupy that country would be a nightmare for the US in the 90s when it was at its peak, at the peak of its post-war power. It's categorically impossible today. And so, like, the US renamed the Department of Defense to the Department of War recently. It's somewhat up in the air whether, like, they're allowed to do this. Whether the president can do something like this, or it requires an act like a law passed by Congress. But nobody really cares about the law in the US, so they just did it. This was, apart from the jingling keys aspect of so much of American politics today, I think this was seen as a sort of attempt to go back to, okay, we suffered this defeat. We're no longer like the America we were in the 90s, but we can still pick up a small country and throw it against the wall, just like we did with Iraq or whatever. We just have to choose a smaller country than we used to. I think that's like part of this renaming, like the idea behind it, is to show that, okay, even if we're admitting defeat in this one particular area, we are still like going to be hyper aggressive everywhere else. But that's not how these things work. The US, even in a war against Venezuela at this point, is reliant on essentially Maduro either, committing, like cutting his belly up with a samurai sword, like in Kurosawa movie, because he has dishonored the nation or whatever, like basically voluntarily giving up. Or the Venezuelan people rising, welcoming Americans as liberators, basically starting a civil war inside Venezuela, throwing open the doors to the Americans and saying, please refine our oil at, cutthroat prices, like just loot our stuff. And like the US, even when it tries to go against like its own backyard at this point, unless it's going to be against a nation like Panama or something, or a nation that straight up doesn't have a military at all, it is forced to rely on hopes and prayers, like the kindness of enemies, essentially. I never really agreed with like the Elbridge Colby's like China First doctrine, but insofar as, like, if you look at the premises, it's correct. Like, if you want to be an empire, you have to be an empire in Asia. Trying to retreat, trying to be an empire that gives up against its competitors, that just means the empire is going to collapse even faster because of all of these, like, knock-on effects.
I suppose that, just to play devil's advocate here, I suppose that the counter-argument to that goes like this. The US is still an enormous economy. It still has a half-decent manufacturing sector. It's obviously nowhere near what it once was. But it still makes cars, for example. Tesla has a factory there. Hyundai has a factory there, as we learned quite recently. Toyota has factories and Ford has factories. It still makes certain things, although it is reliant on China for capital goods, for example, in manufacturing. But it still has, plenty of natural resources. It still grows its own food. It still has pretty good universities, as far as I can tell. And as I say, it is still a giant, both militarily and economically. It can impose, as we have seen with Europe, as we've seen with Japan, as we've seen with South Korea, it can really throw its weight around still. It might not be able to hold the line at Taiwan, but it can still throw its weight around quite a bit. Now, what it could do in theory is make a deal with the Chinese, a kind of grand bargain with the Chinese. Okay, Taiwan is yours, guys. But in exchange, you're not going to go any farther than that, at least for now. Eventually, both the Americans and the Chinese would understand that eventually China would go farther than that, but that's, how these things work, so they would both accept that. And in the meantime, the Americans would concentrate on the Western Hemisphere, where, as I say, they can throw a whole, great deal of weight around. They could, blockade Venezuela, for example, and really put the screws on it. They still have allies in places like Ecuador and Peru, and probably to a certain degree in Mexico as well. So, the flip side of that is, if somebody like Elbridge Colby, who, as you quite rightly said, literally wrote the book on containing China and why it was important to do so, if he has, spent 6 months in the Department of Defense assessing matters, and in the meantime seen the deliveries to Ukraine continue, seen the US have to pour ever greater amounts of munitions into Israel, seen attacks on the Houthis, seen attacks on Iran, and just thought, look, we are in no position to contain the Chinese. We're in no position to fight a war against the Chinese. And if we're not in a position to fight a war against China, it would be a mistake to bluff. Therefore, what we need to do is craft a neo-Monroe doctrine, get the best deal that we possibly can with China for a kind of, not so much a retreat from the Western Pacific, but a kind of a modus vivendi in which we can both operate in the Western Pacific and the Taiwanese can reach the understanding that their future is going to be with the mainland Chinese. And we can start focusing on securing our own hemisphere and making it, so that it's extremely difficult for the Chinese to come in and interfere. We don't want it to turn into what Eastern Europe became for the Russians after 1991. I think that's, for a country of, with the size and power of the United States, that, is that not reasonable, Malcolm?
I think that it is reasonable, and that is why it will never happen. I mean, the ancients were fond of saying that those the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. And I think that if you look at the US today, you have to conclude that the ancients were right about quite a lot of things, this one included. Because again, the US has resources. That is quite correct. And it could, husband them. Like, the resources are much more limited than most Americans acknowledge. But, if the Americans were willing to take stock of what they had and what they could do, and actually sort of use those resources to their maximum effect, they could do a lot of things. But you might as well go out and search for, the Loch Ness Monster or whatever, or Bigfoot or something, or the aliens from X-Files. These things are rumored to exist. The willingness in America to sit down and do this kind of thinking. But none have ever seen it actually, all we have is blurry photos from 30 years ago. We have nothing today. If you think about the US military posture right now, or just the US political system in general, it wasted all of these resources on Ukraine, thinking, Russia is just a gas station with nukes. What are they going to do? What are the Russians going to do? They can't win a war against us. They're gonna crumble in 2 weeks. Well, they didn't, did they? Has anyone inside any Western country at any point said, okay, well, this isn't working. I guess our assumptions were incorrect. Trump right now is talking about entering, and I quote, the second phase of sanctions against Russia. Well, presumably the second phase is going to do exactly what people said that the first phase was going to do. And after the second phase is complete, we're going to have a third and a fourth and a fifth phase. And each phase is going to do bring about the thing that sanctions were going to do in 72 hours, which is collapse Russia, any day now. You mentioned Hyundai. Recently, there was a controversy because ICE raided we talked about this before we started recording. ICE raided the Hyundai, one of the factories they were building. I think this project started under Biden, but I'm not 100% sure on that. ICE raided a factory and they found a lot of Koreans that they claimed were there illegally. And they probably were there illegally, considering that this is not terribly uncommon. But for once in living memory, all editorial boards of Korean media, from the progressive left to the conservative right to the business press, all of them agree on this. On one thing, first time they've ever agreed on anything, but like that this was a national humiliation because ICE didn't just arrest these people, they led them away in chains, and they filmed it. And the issue here is that the Korean story is that, well, I mean, the US visa process is basically a joke. Like, Koreans can't actually get the visas we need in order to industrialize your country, which you asked us to do. And then, and I don't think it's all that unlikely that some of these companies, at least, were told by the Biden administration that it doesn't really matter if your workers overstay, like their ESTA visas or what, like visa waivers or whatever, because like ICE isn't gonna arrest some guy building a factory right now that Americans are gonna work in. Like, that would be ridiculous. Why would we arrest you when you're here to build a factory for us? Well, I mean, now the raid happened. So maybe they were never told that, or they were, and like the Trump admin doesn't like honor the promises of previous administrations. The Americans at this point, if you look at like social media, a lot of people are sharing this on. Like, it's those damn Koreans, like they broke the law. How dare they? Well, I mean, like a lot of people break the law in the US, and there's obviously a lot of discretion for this kind of stuff. And you could have just picked up a phone and told these people to self-deport. You wouldn't have to put them in chains, and you certainly wouldn't have to film putting them in chains. But Americans just generally believe that, like, Hyundai is over in America, like, trying to affect tech transfer, like, as a favor from the Americans to Hyundai. Like, no African would do this against like Chinese engineers, regardless of whether they were there illegally, because Africans don't believe that like they have Chinese engineers over in Africa as a favor to China. It's the other way around. And so they have a bit of humility, let's just say, in the face of the realities of trying to reindustrialize yourself. Americans don't have any humility at all. Like, as the decline sets in, you see all of these psychological and political patterns being repeated that actually just make the decline accelerate. Like, as the US loses an industrial base, you have all of these narratives that it's like Korea's fault or Europe's fault or whatever, and not like the Americans' own damn fault. And then when you arrest people at Hyundai, people just, yeah, stick it to them. Like, why are they even here in the first place? Like, America today cannot even avoid self-sabotage for 5 seconds. So if you pose to me that, like, if they did everything right, they could have some sort of like national, like a very strong policy in South America. Yes. But Americans today are not capable even of having any sort of strategy. Like, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And the right hand doesn't care about what it was doing 4 seconds ago. Like, 4 seconds after, the right hand is doing something completely opposite to what it was doing. The ability for the American political system to even formulate a strategy or even like have some sort of basic like memory retention is disappearing as the empire crumbles. By all accounts, like, this Venezuelan operation looks like a very sort of flying by the seat of your pants. Like, someone had a weird idea like at 5 a.m. in the morning, and they said, wouldn't it be really cool if we invaded Venezuela or went to war against them? And then, they kind of roll with it. You don't really see a lot of capability for reflection or humility or strategy in America today.
I think this gets to something that you and I were talking about earlier. So I want to kind of frame the discussion with a short essay, which I'd really recommend that people go and read. It's by Harvard Law professor Adrian Vermeule. It's called Monstrous Government. I think it was published in 2021. It might have been 2022. It was during the Biden administration. And Vermeule goes back to a classical thinker from the Renaissance period, kind of the Machiavellian realist tradition. And this thinker, I can't remember his name, he's not very well known outside of specialist circles, basically says that there is a form of government called monstrous government. And it's basically a city-state, they always talk in terms of city-states in Italy and so on, run by multiple competing tyrants. So in classical political philosophy, you'd sometimes get a tyrant who ruled over everybody in a really negative way. Unlike a good king who would rule over and everyone would be prosperous, the tyrant would kind of exercise domination over the people and loot the place and keep the women for himself and all this kind of thing. And this political thinker who Vermeule is referencing says, actually, the tyranny isn't the worst form of government. Aristotle would have said tyranny is the worst form of government. He said tyranny isn't the worst form of government. Monstrous government is worse, which has a kind of a city-state or a country run by multiple tyrants, and they're all kind of at odds with each other, or loosely at odds with each other, but they're kind of looting out of their own little, patch or whatever. And Vermeule is effectively, he doesn't say it explicitly, but he's trying to describe what was happening during the Biden administration, which seems a long time ago now. But I think we all kind of know what that means. Biden was kind of asleep at the helm. He wasn't compos mentis for most of his presidency, and it felt like other forces were running the show. And those other forces, loosely speaking, were probably corporate interests, but more so probably actually competing factions within the US state. Within the deep state, as they call it. State Department competing with Treasury, all these competing forces trying to kind of like get their mode of influence in. And because the old man was asleep in the chair, nobody ruled over it. Well, the kind of implication of the monstrous government essay, at least how I read it, was basically that you just need a strong leader to come in. And the strong leader needs to come in and they need to put all these Hydra heads in their place. And the strong leader needs to reestablish some sort of a grand vision for the country. I don't think that was completely wrong. I think there was a lot of truth to that. But I don't think we've got that in the Trump administration. In fact, it looks increasingly that things are being done at odds with one another in an even more obvious way, right? So you gave the South Korean example. What that did geopolitically, of course, was massively interfere with the American-South Korean relationship. Now, it would seem on paper at least that no matter what really the Americans are doing in East Asia, they'd want the South Koreans on board. Because if they're pulling back, they want the South Koreans on board to maintain, some commercial interests there, maybe some, soft power influence. Just make sure the whole situation's stable. There's military bases in South Korea, so even if you're going to take them out of the country, you're going to want a happy government there so that you can extract your soldiers gradually and that there's no negativity or anything like that. Whereas if you want to beef up your position in East Asia, you'll obviously want to bolster South Korea. You'll want to get them on side. You'll want to make sure that they don't tilt toward China or anybody else. Well, whatever else it did, the mass arrest of these Hyundai workers has, as you said, completely angered the South Koreans. So in that sense, it seems like, for example, if we hypothesize that the arrest of these workers was done by Homeland Security, I think they control ICE, maybe it was done by the Department of Justice. And then we understand that the Pentagon and the Department of State have a completely different set of interests in South Korea. It does appear that those two forces, in a sense, are working against each other. Yet this isn't because of a monstrous government dynamic. It's clearly not. It's because of something else. And I think that's kind of the mystery right now. It's how do we describe the current system in America? I'm not sure I actually fully understand what's going on. I've some sense that maybe various government departments or various heads in those government departments are trying to compete for the president's attention. And they don't tend to communicate very well with each other. I think something like that might be happening. But Malcolm, I'd be interested in your take.
Yeah, I mean, when I read the essay by Vermeule, I initially wasn't terribly impressed because I think the most natural criticism of it is just, okay, but there's three basic modes of government: ruled by the many, ruled by the few, and ruled by the one. And each one has a good version and a bad version. So like for rule by the few, you have oligarchy, and you have a like aristocratic republic. And rule by the one, you have a monarchy, and then you have a tyranny. Why not just say we have an oligarchy? Like what's the new thing under the sun here? And Vermeule was talking about like courts and so on. They have courts in oligarchies. Like I don't really see what's so special about courts blocking stuff, especially when the stuff that's being done is like blatantly illegal or whatever, or like way beyond the pale, such as, using emergency authority to basically declare that every weekday is an emergency, and every weekday the next 40 years will be an emergency, so I have total power to impose tariffs on anyone I want. Like that, a court blocking that is not something you have to go, wow, how do I explain this? Like, that's what courts are supposed to do. If you don't want them doing that, you should go for a political system that don't have courts at all, and you avoid that. Like, it's very simple. But now that I'm thinking about Vermeule's thesis here, I think there is actually some merit to it in that, like, we are actually moving away from an oligarchy towards something that is, like, monstrous. I would just locate it like less in sort of, well, we have bureaucracies fighting each other, or we have like different power centers. Again, the ancients, the Greeks, would look at that and say, well, we designed a category for it. It's called oligarchy. The writer that Vermeule cites, basically, when he justifies his innovation, like the monstrous government, it's that you have these different like tyrants. So you have like an element of rule by the one, but there are several ones, and they pull in different directions, which is, again, like, this is different from an oligarchy, because if it wasn't, you wouldn't need a different term. And I think there is a case to be made that America is right now an example of that. And that has to do with an area I don't think Vermeule was comfortable plumbing when he wrote that essay. It would have been too much of a spicy tamale, I think. But today it's more obvious, and it's less of a hot stove. So if you think about the 12-day war, the US spent 25% of all missile interceptors that have ever been produced. 25% of all THAAD missile interceptors, so like the really expensive ones. 25% of them went to defend Israel in the 12-day war, following an attack by Israel on Iran that Trump was out in the media saying, please don't attack. Like, this is against, I told them not to do this. Those missiles were supposed to go to defend against China in the South China Sea. And they aren't going to be replaced. There is very little, like nobody in the Pentagon, for example, that I know of, is willing to make the argument that wasting those missiles was in any way in the US national interest. And I think that if we took sort of a poll among the people you and I know in DC, Philip, I think like 0% of the people like in the wonkish think tank world would say, oh yeah, like there is an American national interest in this. If we're just talking about the THAADs. But if we're talking more broadly, I think the case becomes even stronger. That like America right now is basically caught between like the American national interest and like the national interest of a foreign government, which obviously has a lot of pull among the American political class. And at this point, you can't really talk about an oligarchy anymore. Because an oligarchy, it's like you have all of these internal power centers inside a republic, say, and these power centers are concerned about themselves. Well, I mean, at this point, you have like external power centers, and in some cases, those power centers are essentially looting the American armories. And I think that there's even like at this point, Israel has a lot of problems, obviously, like it can't finance all of these wars. Like it is basically broke. So several American states or counties at this point have these programs where they buy Israeli debt or they lend money to Israel at zero interest, and where the Israelis basically there's no mechanism to punish them if they just say, oh, we're not going to pay this back. If you're a county in Florida, Florida is one of the states that have this program going on. If you're a county in Florida and you have free cash flow as a county, you have to invest that money into something that gives you a return. This money is supposed to go to, road maintenance or pensions or whatever for your own, the people in your county. If you're taking that money and basically giving it to a foreign government at a point where you might lose, you're losing the interest by default because there is no interest, but you might lose the principal as well. You are basically stealing from your own citizens. And again, this is a scenario that the ancients would not explain this as an oligarchy. They would say, okay, we're stumped on this. Okay, maybe this idea of the monstrous government, the government that is a Siamese twin or whatever, one body, two heads pulling in different directions. Yeah, maybe this idea has some cachet. I don't really think that America is particularly unique in terms of all of the things that people on the right used to complain about, like courts, for example. I think the issue with courts is widely overblown because courts exist to enforce the law as written. And the big elephant in the room in the US is that Congress is just taking a permanent vacation, they no longer pass laws. The only issue that Trump might, this tariff thing, for example, they're now talking, Scott Bessent was out in the media saying we might have to issue refunds for all of these Trump tariffs. And that would be not just a political, but a financial disaster as well. And it truly would be, because not only would the government lose a lot of money, all of these companies that had to close their doors or had to cancel contracts or whatever, they're going to get the fees, the tariffs back, but they're not going to get the profit they could have made. So it's just huge destruction all around. And for what? If you have to stop doing the tariffs, it was all in vain. The only reason this is even a thing that could happen is because Trump, rather than going to Congress, which is supposed to have the authority to do this stuff, and I mean, the Republican Party controls both chambers of Congress, both the House and the Senate. So there's they wouldn't be blocked by Democrats even. If they actually passed laws, with new tariffs, the courts would just say, okay, well, this is the law. We don't even have an opinion on whether these tariffs are good for the country or not, but they're legal, so our job is done. But they didn't. Again, normalization here is not really the non-functioning of massive parts of the state has been so normalized that people say that the courts operating fairly normally is some big upset or whatever. No, it's one part of the state that hasn't totally broken down.